While it's nice to have a smaller version of the MixConsole in your project window, the real power of mixing in Cubase is handled in the full MixConsole, which you can get to by going to the Studio menu and selecting MixConsole, or by typing F3. And as I mentioned before, it's a separate window, so you could put this MixConsole onto a separate monitor if you wanted to. Then there are a few similarities between the project window and the MixConsole because there are also zones in the MixConsole. They're handled slightly differently though. If you close the right console, then you'll lose the control room or the meter, and if you want to, you can set this up exactly the same way as you would in the project window, my favorite way, which is going to the meter tab and then turning on the control room. In the left zone, you have things like the visibility tab, the history, snapshots, and then there's a separate setting for channels and zones. And I'll get more into that in just a moment. But the real work in the MixConsole typically happens in the mixer that's down here at the bottom with the faders, as well as the associated parameters of those channels, which are known as racks. Each one of these racks can be opened simply by clicking on one of them. Here's the routing rack, and you can see that when you click on that, it reveals the routing for all of the channels that you have in your MixConsole. And then if you wanted to open up the inserts, you can click on that. You'll notice that it doesn't close the tab before, it leaves each of those open. So sometimes you start to load this window up with so much stuff that it's hard to keep track of things, in which case you may want to close the other racks. But here are the inserts. For MIDI tracks, you'll have the MIDI inserts, and for audio-based tracks, you would have things like chorus effects and delays and compressors and so forth, so only audio effects will show up for the channels that handle audio information. And then here's the equalizer, and so you can continue to open up these racks as you go, but you'll notice that if you start to really load this up again, you may need to use your scroll wheel to scroll up and down, or you can also use the scroll bar over here on the right-hand side. And so let's close up this rack. One of the other things that you may have noticed is that there are no EQ controls for this particular track, and the reason why is because that's a MIDI track, and since it doesn't have any audio information on it, then there's no way to EQ that audio. So on MIDI tracks, you will not see the EQ rack or the strip effects. Strip effects are only for audio-based tracks, which is why you see it on the Halion Sonic instrument here. It's a virtual instrument that does create audio from within the computer, and therefore you could add EQ to that channel or add all of the different types of effects in the strip setting. And the MixConsole also has its own undo and redo. You'll notice that these little buttons that are the undo and redo buttons are the same as you would find in the MixConsole, but they work differently. Here, the undo and redo commands only work on what's happened in the project window, whereas in the MixConsole, they control what you've changed in the mix. And you can see what you've changed by clicking on the History tab. And here we have all the different things that I've done. For example, if I moved this master fader up and down, then you'll see that that part of the history gets recorded. Or if I turned up the bass channel, then the bass channel volume shows up in the history here. And if you wanted to undo any of those changes, you could come up to the undo and redo control buttons here on the MixConsole, or you can hold down Alt or Option and type Z for undo, or Shift with Alt or Option and Z to redo. Or in the history list here, you can also just go back in time. So all of those different settings that you've made, or all the different edits that you've made, can be undone or redone at any time. You can also change the height difference between the faders and the racks by hovering your mouse over that little delineator and then moving it up or down. Or if you got into a situation where you really needed to have tall versions of the faders without seeing any of the racks, you can come to this button, which will allow you to turn off the channel racks themselves. So here we just have big versions of the faders, or we can see the channel racks, or there's some other stuff that you can add here. You could go to the channel overview to see that. You could add a separate meter bridge or the equalizer curve. So all of these different things can change how much information you're seeing in the MixConsole, and how much you'll be able to actually use will really be determined by how high a resolution or how big your monitor is, because the more of these things you add, the tighter it can get here on the MixConsole. So I'm going to go back to just the default setting of the channel racks visible only, as well as the left zone and right zone. And next, let's talk about zooming.